I would like to touch on the important topic of how actually boards get properly informed about the company stakeholder and their priorities, and how management is processing that information and delivering it most effectively into the boardroom to enable strategic decision making. And would like to turn to Niamh with the question about the expectations from the board papers, and in particular, what's the line for the board papers when they become too operational and they become effectively management papers, and how does that impact the conversation in the boardroom?
Absolutely, and it's something that we see a huge amount with board papers. Is they're not actually board papers. They're essentially management papers being given to the board, and that can be for a variety of different reasons. But actually, when papers are too operational, too detail heavy, and too data technical heavy, depending on the type of organization, what that then does is cloud the messaging between management and the board. So actually, Monica touched on it earlier. For the board members, are saying, what do you want from me? What do you want back from me individually and us collectively? And the challenge of papers that are too operational is it tempts the board to then become operational and have operational conversations. And actually, it was exactly as you were saying, that give boards any chance to have operational conversations and get down into the weeds, they'll take it. But it's not their role. And so it's looking at how you give the board, we say the difference between what we call a worm's eye view and a bird's eye view, how you give the board the right information, but also touching on the relationship between the chair and the CEO, but also the board and the management team, that the board have confidence that the information they're being given is the right level and detail for them. So if that is less than they're expecting, or if it is at a higher level, then they can have confidence in the management team that the management are giving them the level of information that's appropriate for them. And the management team can have confidence that their committee structures and their governance structures are set up so that the information is being surfaced at the right areas in the organisations. The committees are doing their jobs properly, and therefore what comes to management and what then needs to come up to the board, the papers effectively get sliced at each level up to the top of the organisation. So when the board pack goes to the board, it only focuses on exactly what management want back from them, and it answers the key questions of what is on your mind as a management team, especially as a CEO. So if we take the CEO specifically, what the board will want to know is what is on your mind, what has gone well, what hasn't gone well, what are the implications of that, and what are you doing about it? That is essentially all they need to know from the board papers. But there needs to be that relationship between the board and the CEO. They can have confidence that you're being given the right information in the right level of detail.
Absolutely. To continue on that, it's also about the information flow back and forth. So, Monica, how do you balance this critical information flow? It's not only about what goes into the boardroom, but what comes out and goes back to the management.
I just want to comment on something you said. So, because board effectiveness, there's one global problem today, that's that boards are lacking time. So the more blurry documentation, papers, etc., the harder it is to really have an efficient board agenda, and they create value. So that's exactly what we can see as well. So exactly the information flow back and forth. So it's all about balancing information, supporting the company and all stakeholders. And today it's really stakeholder management, and there's only one role the board has, is to focus on the value creation, but then to balance all stakeholders. And of course, that's related, how you do that is related to manufacturers and the ownership structures. For instance, if you look at that, the owners vary. So that's one field that will set how you deal with that. Scattered ownership, more concentrated, etc. The thing is that information needs to be transparent, but then tailored to different groups. And that's really a hard work these days. Also, when you look at ESG, because the board need to work much more with searching questions, it's a field where more or less everyone needs to put searching questions. So that's one way of dealing with that topic. And of course, in listed companies like we are focusing now, all the inside regulation is getting tougher. So it's very limited what and when you can give information. But again, important that everyone gets information in tandem. But there are certain ways to deal with that, of course. And if you look between on information between the board and the CEO, it's important, it's key that the board is updated on all details. I mean, boards do not like being held in the dark. It's definitely a no-go. But again, they don't want to be too much in the details. So it's a good balance. And I think it's the responsibility both from the CEO and the chairman to structure the information, including the papers, so it is exactly on the right level. Otherwise, you will never get an efficient board work. And directors these days, they're faced with so many responsibilities. So, and everyone, all groups demand a dialogue. So it's more and more common, and it's obvious that institutional investors are working directly with the IR investor relation team. But you need to have a very good governance model in order to not surpass the CEO, and yeah, there are some risks with that, but structure and good governance is really key, and that's part of ESG. Of course, it's the G. It is the G. So I would say that's the main part that we have seen in BoardClic.
Thank you. And so, Oliver, what are some of the practical approaches that you've seen around in terms of facilitating that flow of information to enable a more effective board?
Yeah, so one of my favorite is the board to use advisory boards. We had recently a sort of AM500 professional service firm looking to expand internationally, and they put together an advisory board of, it was a law firm. They brought in management consultants, accountants, lawyers at the partner level into their advisory board. And suddenly it created time and a safe space where it was very clear there was no governance there. It was all about helping that CEO think through their strategy. And what that does, by having that sort of outside party, you can shine a light very quickly, identify where the blockages are in the system. So, using that pattern recognition. So that's one really neat way that we see. The other related to that is a buddy system where they take those advisory board members and they match them up to functional leaders and have them working as mentors, but it's a two-way information flow, which allows the CEO or the rest of the board to understand the issues more and gets them more connected. You see quite a few boards using horizon boards, next generation boards, where they get sort of younger members or the next generation of leadership starting to feed in on the same challenges to make sure boards are aligned and also get fresh perspectives. And then I think the other interesting one that we're seeing more and more of is boards looking to get their executives a non-executive perspective. I know from personal experience how difficult that change was when you're sitting on the executive side of the table. You're sitting there thinking, how did the board not get this? Mm-hmm. And then you go and sit on the other side of the table as a board member, you think, how on earth are we supposed to do anything with this information you provided? And so having execs who really understand what it is to be a non-exec is very powerful and helps them get more out of the board. So those are some of the things.
Great, thank you. So now we would like to cover an important topic of actually building a culture of constructive debate and outcomes-focused governance, because we're talking about two distinct groups of people, the executives and non-executives that have their competencies, but yet they need to be united by common objectives. And at the same time, there needs to be enough room for a constructive challenge. So I would like to explore this topic a bit further, starting with Niamh. What are some of the implications, the practical implications of the board management relations, and how do they manifest themselves in terms of the outcomes?
We look at those practical applications in terms of agility and speed to change. So if you unpack agility, it can be one of two things. It can be your ability to spot risks and opportunities, and then your ability to adapt to those as an organization. And we find where you have a good board management relationship and when that is then facilitated by a good and appropriate flow of information, it does help organizations to become more agile. However agility is defined, and it will change for different types of organizations, but that ability then to have that insight into the business, to look at what they can change and how quickly they can adapt, because that communication line between the board and between the management team is there, it's effective, it's working, it's being given the right level and detail of information at the right time. Other ways that you can see it having a more practical impact is looking at investor feedback, looking at making sure stakeholders are considered, especially with listed organizations, looking at their regulatory objectives to make sure that key stakeholders have been considered, and whether it's ESG, whether it's, as we're seeing a lot in the financial services sector with consumers, how consumers are being not just considered as part of the business, day-to-day business operations, but how the board are ensuring that a customer-centric decision-making process is really embedded throughout the organisation. The responses to that are some of the more practical outcomes. The financial services point is an interesting one that I'd like to pick up on a bit more, because when you mentioned the word outcomes, the difference that we're seeing with the focus on consumers at the moment is the shift from the way the FCA are looking at it, from a rules-based approach to an outcomes-based approach. That shift by nature means there is a more vague responsibility. A rules-based approach is very much, these are the tick boxes you need to do to have effective compliance and to have effective board and management relations. Now it's an outcomes-based approach. It's much vaguer, and it is, this is the outcome, in this case putting consumers at the heart of what we do, that we are driving towards as an organisation. They're not being any more prescriptive than that. So what that means, it's important then, is for the board and the management team to be aligned on how do we, in this case, how do we demonstrate that we're putting consumers at the heart of what we do, and how are we making sure that every decision we make and every agenda item that we discuss has a nod to that. So you can see that come out in the reporting, but that's certainly one of the more practical applications that we're seeing, is really looking at how do you change that mindset and how do you change the culture shift of an organisation to focus around key stakeholder priorities and to make sure that information is being escalated quickly and appropriately through the management team to the board.
Absolutely. Monica, it would be interesting to bring in some of the data you have